It's not about me. Not at all. I used to call myself the least of the apostles, but the closer I got to Jesus, the more I thought about it, and the more I realized that that's being too generous. So then I started calling myself the least of all the saints. And the closer I got to Jesus, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that's being way too generous. So now, I just call myself the chief of sinners. Yeah, that about fits me. Chief of sinners. Who am I, you ask?
Paul the Apostle. We're talking about Paul the Apostle. But isn't that amazing that his first letters, he's saying that he's the least of the apostles. Then later in life, the closer he gets to Jesus, he starts calling himself the least of the saints. Then towards the end of his life, he calls himself the chief of sinners. The closer we get to Jesus, the more we know Jesus, the more we realize that we are far from being like him. And in 1 John chapter 3 verse 2, it says that we're not going to be like Jesus until he appears. Then he'll complete that good work in us. But today, I want to show you where Paul the Apostle tells us that all of the Bible is about Jesus. He backs up what Peter said in our last video and also supports what the resurrected Jesus said in our very first video of this channel. So let's dive right into this quick study of when Paul tells us that it's all about Jesus. This channel is all about Jesus, how all of the Bible, even the Old Testament, points to and speaks of Jesus Christ. He's a close personal friend of mine. This is video number 3, so check out the first 2 videos as they are connected to this one. They're linked together like a chain, or like these 2 paper clips. Linked together like my fingers. Ta-da! I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel, and after subscribing, if you would hit the bell icon. Why hit the bell? Because it's fun! And you'll be notified of new videos. Also, feel free to share this video wherever you want. I don't care. Sharing is caring. We're going to look at Acts chapter 26 today. This is the middle of a court case. Paul the Apostle is on trial because he was preaching about Jesus. Paul dedicated his life to sharing the message about Jesus, which caused him threats against his personal life, alienation from his people, and legal problems continually. So he's on trial with non-Jewish authorities presiding. Festus was the governor and also a character on Gunsmoke. And Agrippa was the king. So by the time chapter 26 opens, the king gives Paul permission to speak. And in verse 2, Paul says, I consider myself fortunate. He's thrilled to be able to share about Jesus before these governing dignitaries. I remember the old Law and Order television shows where the first 30 minutes showed the crime and the last 30 minutes were nothing but the court case. Well, this is basically the last 30 minutes. It's the court case portion, and it would be a great episode. Verse 29 tells us he's in chains, but verse 1 says that he stretched forth his hand, or stretched out his hand, so chains are rattling, and there's tension in the air as Paul presents the gospel. And basically he's sharing his story to a huge group of people. I've always said you have a history to tell his story. Get it? His story, history. Now Paul is doing that, and he opens by telling them in verse 4 that since he was young, he was super religious. And those people that knew him in those days, they could come and testify to that fact if they would. And in verse 6, he's saying, okay, we all know why I'm here. It's all about what God has promised us, that God would send a Messiah, a deliverer. He's talking about Jesus, whom God raised from the dead. Then in verses 9 through 11, Paul starts to talk about what his response was to the resurrected Jesus and how he persecuted those that once put their faith and trust in Jesus. Then in verses 12 through 18, Paul shares how he personally came to know Jesus, which is also described in Acts chapter 9. And I was thinking maybe in the comments, you might want to mention in just 1 or 2 sentences how you came to know Jesus. I was invited to a church by someone that was in a fast food drive-through window. And they invited me to church and I went. That's my quick story. What's yours? Mention it in the comments. That would be great to hear. But let's continue on. In verses 19 and 20, Paul said that he was being obedient in sharing the message that Jesus gave him. And in verse 21, he says, that's why I was captured. That's why they wanted to kill me. Now, here is the main verse that I wanted to stress. It's the end of verse 22. Paul was saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass. He's not sharing Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. He's sharing the Old Testament and how it speaks of Jesus Christ. This is the same thing that the resurrected Jesus said in our first video in Luke 24:44, and also what Peter said in Acts chapter 3 and in Acts chapter 10 in our second video, that it's all about Jesus, the entire Bible. That's what Paul was saying in verse 22. And in verse 23, that Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead and be a light for everyone, both Jews and Gentiles. Then in verse 24, Festus, kind of like an insane person, he accuses Paul of being insane. Then in verse 27, Paul asked King Agrippa, he said, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe. In other words, if you believe the Old Testament, well, it kind of keeps pointing to and talking about Jesus. And if you believe what the Old Testament says, you ought to believe Jesus. And in verse 28, Agrippa admits that Paul almost has him convinced, but either you are a believer or you're not a believer. Almost is not going to get you to heaven. And the chapter concludes with the authorities deciding that Paul has done nothing to deserve death, and he could be released. But he's appealed to Caesar. So by law, they have to send him to Caesar. So the next chapter, chapter 27, Paul is a prisoner and he's sailing to Rome so that he could be on trial before Caesar, which I hear is a good salad. But the tiny ship was tossed, and if it wasn't for the courage of fearless Paul, I promised they'd be lost. I promised they'd be lost. Is that a copyright violation? Then the next chapter is chapter 28. Paul finally arrives in Rome, and in verse 17, he's allowed to speak to the local Jewish leaders. And Paul talks about his accusers, but they were kind of too chicken to come to Rome and speak against Paul. And in verse 21, they basically said, Paul, we've not heard anything bad about you. If there was any evidence or any letters that were sent, we don't have them. I'm thinking maybe they were lost on that shipwreck. But then they wanted to hear from Paul. And this is beautiful. Verse 23, it's awesome. It says, from morning till evening, he expounded to them, testifying to the kingdom of God and trying to convince them about Jesus, both from the law of Moses and from the prophets. All night long, Paul used the first 5 books of the Bible and most of the other Old Testament Bible books talking about Jesus. And it says some believed and some didn't. As I've said, this channel is all about Jesus and how all of the Bible points to Jesus. Thousands of years of writing are all about Jesus. Jesus said it, that was our first video. Peter said it, that was our second video. And now Paul said it. When you have 3 sources, that makes strong theology. So there you go. Peter, Paul, and Mary. Well, Peter, Paul, and Jesus. But Mary was his mom. So yeah, Peter, Paul, and Mary. It's all about Jesus. That's why I say follow Jesus. Trust in Jesus. Because you never know when